Welcome all of you to Old South Presbyterian Church. My name's Laurel Cockrell. I'm the pastor here of the church, and there are several Old South folks. Would you please raise your hand so that people can, everybody look around. These are the people who know where the bathrooms are. This is an exceedingly old building, and we had to hide the bathrooms in funny places. So if you need to know where to go at any point, down either side here, there's a ramp on one side and stairs on the other, and bathrooms are through there. We're sharing the space today with the Boy Scouts, so hopefully they won't be too loud. But we are so delighted, this congregation is so delighted to have so many of our friends and neighbors here with us this afternoon. This building was given to us as a mighty and great inheritance. It was built as a meeting house. And anytime that we can have people here, and this is a meeting house for our neighbors, it lights us up. So we're so excited and so happy to have you here. I have the honor and privilege of opening us in prayer. And before I do that, I want to just share a little something with you. Many of us have been setting tables a lot. It's the holiday season, and we're gathering our families around tables. And it reminded me once I inherited a set of china from an elder in my family. And I love china, I love dishes, and this china, it was beautiful, but it was also the kind that goes in a dishwasher. So it was just, And I was so excited to receive it because the person in the generation between the person who had spent years and years collecting this china wasn't really very interested in it. And she knew that I would be. So she said, I've got this, this set, and it's blah, 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 and it's in these boxes. Do you want them? Oh my gosh, yes, please, thank you. So I got the boxes home, and I began to unpack them. And they hadn't been packed away very well, with very much care. And there were beautiful, beautiful pieces of, serving pieces and dishes and gravy boats and all kinds of lovely things. And about half of what was in there was broken. And I thought, isn't that just how our histories are? We all inherit history. And some of it is so beautiful and so usable. And some of it is just so very broken. And it's not so much the fact that we've inherited it as it is what we do with it. So what do we do with it? Well, I got out the crazy glue. And I put together the things that could be put together. And then some of the things were just so broken that I had to save the little pieces in order to make something new, like a little mosaic tile table or backsplash. What we do with our broken histories is just as important, maybe more important than what we do with our perfect and beautiful histories. Our Holy Scriptures tell us that we have inherited a ministry of reconciliation. And I think that's what we're here doing right now. And it makes my heart so happy and so glad to have you here, Dr. Kelly, and all of you. So, that said, I'll invite you who are praying people to join me in prayer. Lord of all, we thank you for this ministry of reconciliation to which all your children are called. And especially today, we are grateful to the gifted scholars you are equipping every day to teach us how to be transformed by the powerful story they tell. It's in your spirit we pray. Amen.
Hello, everyone. I'm Kathleen Shaw. I am on the Newburyport Human Rights Commission. I'm a founding member of over 20 years. And just wanted to share a little bit about the Human Rights Commission and our connection to International Human Rights Day, as well as William Lloyd Garrison. We honor William Lloyd Garrison and its commitment to promote abolition and suffrage. It's vital to remember those engaged in resistance to the status quo and resistance to horrific violence and injustice. International Human Rights Day is December 10th, the same day as Garrison's birthday. It was on this day in 1948 that the United Nations put forth a Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You can see these displayed when you join us for refreshments later in the Fellowship Hall. Human rights belong to every person on the planet. The theme this year is Our Rights, Our Future, Right Now. So part of my connection to William Lloyd Garrison is we do a Peace Prize every spring where we honor students, 2 students from each of the schools in Newburyport, as well as 2 community adult members. And it's kind of evolved that I read this every year. So if you go up to Brown Square, you'll see the statue of William Lloyd Garrison. And so I'm going to read from the quotes that are on the statue. Neither God nor the world will judge us by our professions, but by our practices. I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not extract a single inch, and I will be heard. I solicit no man's praise. I fear no man's censure. And the liberty of a people is the gift of God and nature. So with that said, and also you can see any individuals wearing hats like this. These are the colors on the Human Rights Commission logo. So that's would identify us. And feel free, if you're at all interested in knowing more about the commission, please approach any of us wearing the chapeau. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen, and Pastor Laurel for welcoming us to this sanctuary. Our work is before us. It is to disseminate light, to change public opinion, to plead every man with his neighbor, to insist upon justice, to demand equal rights. Thus, in March of 1858, did William Lloyd Garrison denounce the United States Supreme Court's despicable, dehumanizing ruling in the case of Dred Scott, an enslaved man who sued under the laws of this land the man who claimed to own him, also under the laws of this land. So good afternoon, my name is Bill Quigley, and as a member of the Friends of William Lloyd Garrison, who sponsored this lecture series, I am honored to introduce tonight's speaker. I also want to recognize and thank 2 descendants of William Lloyd Garrison who are here with us tonight. If they could please stand, both Frank Garrison and Edith Griffith. I quote Garrison to begin because he reminds us across the ages that this work is now before us. It is to disseminate light. Tonight's speaker is working to do just that. Now, I can stand here and tell you about her credentials. They're impressive. The position she holds at a leading American institution of higher education, the books she has written, the notable journals, magazines, and newspapers that publish her essays, the prizes she has won. But you can read all of that for yourselves in the program. I'd like to comment instead on the significance of her work, if you'll bear with me for a few minutes, the history that she's bringing to light. Our speaker today is Kelly Carter Jackson, and in her latest book, whose title is also the title of her address tonight, Dr. Jackson reveals that Black Americans have resisted and continue to resist injustice and inhumanities in nuanced ways that belie the false and oversimplified choices of violence or nonviolence. We refuse, she tells us, examine some of the ways that Black people have successfully engaged white supremacy beyond nonviolence. Revolution, protection, force, flight, and joy. But her work employs, and she herself personifies, another mode of rightful resistance that goes without saying in her work on the page. She is what Ta-Nehisi Coates heralds as, quote, the storyteller who can, through words, erode the claims of the powerful. Dr. Jackson shines her light into America's past, particularly into those parts that have been shuttered, buried, and denied the light of truth. In his latest book, titled The Message, Coates states that history is not inert, but contains within it a story that implicates or justifies political order. He quotes the writer and civil rights activist Audre Lorde. The quality of light by which we scrutinize our lives has direct bearing upon the product which we live, and upon the changes which we hope to bring about through our lives. It is within this light that we form those ideas by which we pursue our magic and make it realized. And with that light, writers like Kelly Carter Jackson are, as Coates puts it, examining the stories we have been told and how they undergird the politics we have accepted, and then telling new stories. And new stories, actually the resurrection of old suppressed stories, can work a sort of magic. They can change the world we live in. And don't the powerful know it? Certain books are now banned from public libraries and schools, and half of American teachers and school children, kindergarten through 12th grade, are now literally outlaws for trafficking in certain anti-canonical viewpoints and views on the American experience. The powerful look out, as Coates writes, and see their kingdom besieged by trans Barbies, Muslim mutants, daughters dating daughters, sons trick-or-treating as Wakandan kings. The fear instilled by this rising culture is not for what it does today, but what it augurs for tomorrow. A different world in which the boundaries of humanity are not so easily drawn and enforced. In other words, a world slipping from the grip of normative constructs built to divide and conquer. Such constructs as class, caste, patriarchy, and race. A world recast in no small measure by the work of storytellers, writers, and historians like Kelly Carter Jackson, whose words can erode the claims of the powerful. Few among us here in this sanctuary are young. We're young of heart, of course. But I'm looking out here, and this crowd looks an awful lot like my 50th high school reunion last spring. And I've been teaching high school students for 40 years, teaching them history. The work before us, then, is not for us so much as it's for our children and our grandchildren and great-grandchildren. How can young people make a more perfect union and a better world for themselves and their progeny if we raise them to accept uncritically hidebound history that represents by omission and commission stories at best half-told? So we're blessed today to hear from a brilliant historian whose work and words can help us, and more importantly, can help young people and generations to come to work some good magic. On this journey, Dr. Jackson writes in her book's introduction, we will refuse lies and resist the status quo. Together in a new direction, we will walk, run, limp, or even skip toward the light. Please give a warm Newburyport welcome to Dr. Kelly Carter Jackson.
That is the best introduction I've ever had in my life. reading the bio, and that's kind of it. That was powerful. And it's got me really excited. And then, and just the story about the pottery and the china and having to put it together. Just such a good introduction. You guys have got me hype and excited tonight. So I'm really happy to be with you. Thank you so much to the Friends of the William Lloyd Garrison Society and to the Old South Church. I'm so happy to be with you today. This feels really special for me. This is one of the last talks I'm giving this year. I have given maybe 60, 70 talks. I've given a lot of talks. And so it feels really good to be here with you all and sort of like the cherry on the ice cream sundae to do this not far from my own home as well. So I like to tell people that I have 10 jobs. And when I say I have 10 jobs, I do a lot of different things. I am a podcaster, I'm a professor, I'm the chair of my department, I do a lot of documentaries, I write a lot of op-eds, I'm a wife, I'm a mom of 3 kids, 10, 7, and 4. I'm tired, chronically, all the time. But I really do see myself as a storyteller. I didn't sort of set out to sort of have this like public persona, but I'm really grateful for the different opportunities that have opened up for me to share history in lots of different ways via through the written word or through sound, through audible, or through visuals, through documentaries and things of that nature. And so I'm always excited to talk about that work today. But what I really want to do is tell stories. And I want to start by telling some family stories and then tell some stories from the book as well for those who have not read or for those who have read but haven't seen sort of the visuals attached with it. So when my great-grandmother Ernesta was about 9 years old, she stepped on a rusty nail. And not long after, infection began to set in. She likely contracted tetanus, a serious bacterial infection that can lead to painful muscle spasms and lead to death if untreated. Her mother, Mary Bullard, was frantic. Ernesta was her only child, and she was going to lose her if she did not act fast. Mary sent Ernesta to the only doctor she knew, a white man who lived in a big house on the other side of town. The white doctor offered to help, but in exchange, Ernesta would have to live with him for the rest of her life, working for his family. Growing up Black and a girl in 1915 left her vulnerable. In rural Alabama, during one of the worst periods of race relations in America, these were the detestable but predictable terms of engagement. Mary, panic-stricken and not wanting to lose her daughter to death, agreed. Thankfully, Ernesta's grandmother, a former slave, and I just want to pause right here because in the book, and while I was researching, I could not figure out my great-great-great-grandmother's name. And I found out 3 days ago that it was Martha. And I was like, what, Martha? And I found out that Martha's only child was Mary. And Mary's only child was Ernesta. And Ernesta's only child was my grandfather, Edward. And Edward's only child was my mother, Norvella. And then Norvella broke the mold and had 7 children, and I remember 6 of those 7 children. So it's just wild. But I had to pause and say that because I'm so excited to know her name now. So thankfully, Ernesta's grandmother, a formerly slave, Martha, intervened and refused the doctor's proposal. She picked up her ailing granddaughter and took her home, and there she administered every natural remedy at her disposal. Ernesta survived, but for the rest of her life, she walked with a limp. Whatever space she entered, whatever path she took, she was marked by a violent racial imprint. My mother told me this story as a child to explain my great-grandmother's limp, and it was not until I was an adult that I realized that the rusty nail was not the root of her trauma. This story has always gripped me for a couple of reasons. First, Ernesta was a child, her mother's only child. How could a doctor refuse a dying child medical care when it was in his ability to heal her? He had abandoned his oath, first, do no harm. Second, nearly 50 years out from slavery, white folks still felt entitled to Black labor and life and perpetuity. Clearly, everything was transactional to this white doctor. Built into the deal he offered was a lifetime of servitude and likely physical and sexual abuse. White supremacy in America can be summed up by these two diabolical options: live a life in bondage, or refuse and limp. To be Black in America is to live life with a limp. My great-grandmother's outcome had nothing to do with biology and everything to do with power. The power of the white doctor to neglect and attempt to exploit a little Black girl who came to him for help. In many ways, We Refuse, this book is not about the white doctor. In many ways, We Refuse is about my great-great-great-grandmother's response, her refusal. It is about her rescue to save my great-grandmother, my grandmother, my mother, myself, and even my daughters. Her refusal was not just no, but never. Refusal is a forceful no. It is a no that is packed full of energy and meaning. We refuse is similar to Black localisms such as nah, or nope, or not today, Satan, or my personal favorite, oh, hell no. I know we're in a church, so sorry about that. I was recently asked about the difference between resistance and refusal. For me, resistance is how one responds to white supremacy, but refusal is why. Refusal abhors oppression and insists on defining how humanity should be understood and treated with dignity and respect and decency. Non-verbally, refusal is a halting hand or a pointed finger waving from side to side or a powerful raised fist. It is a barrier that prevents oppressed people from being consumed. And while refusal can be enacted by an individual, refusal is often collective, which is why the sentiment behind the phrase "we refuse" persists among subjugated people and is a key refrain in Black feminist politics as well as Native politics. Black women have refused to be invisible or small. And my entire book consists of examples of Black people refusing lies, violence, theft, mockery, or second-class citizenship. It shows how our refusal denies whiteness and white supremacy its power and unearned authority. Last summer, I took a trip to Ghana for the first time, and I traveled to the Gold Coast of Elmina to visit one of the largest slave dungeons built by the Portuguese. And on a wall just adjacent to a cell in which they kept rebellious Africans who they left to die a slow death is a plaque. And on it reads, "We are the children of those who refuse to die. We are the children of those who refuse to die." Since the 16th century, Black history has become a history of refusal. And from the moment the slave ships left the coast of Africa for the New World, Black people refused to die. And some even forfeited their lives because they refused to live in the conditions created by their white captors. In the 17th century, Queen Ana Njinga of Indogo refused the terms and broken treaties of the Portuguese, and she fought for decades against the enslavement of her people. In the 18th century, people like Elizabeth Freeman, who upon hearing the Declaration of Independence read out loud, refused to be denied her right to life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. As an enslaved person living in Massachusetts, she took to the courts and sued for her freedom and won. In the 19th century, Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831 was a collective refusal. During the uprising, enslaved people killed nearly 60 men, women, and children. They killed enslavers because they refused to be kept in bondage. They killed white children because they refused to let them perpetuate the system by growing up to become slaveholders. Enslaved people refused to be enslaved even when their efforts to gain freedom failed. Even Black children refuse. During the 1950s and 60s, the American flag was used as a symbol for the civil rights movement. In a sea of Confederate flags all throughout the South, the American flag reminded people that Black people were Americans. Here, 5-year-old Anthony was protesting alongside his mother for her right to vote in Mississippi. Turned away from seeing the governor, an officer attempted to snatch Anthony's flag from his hand. His mother called to him, "Anthony, don't let that man take your flag. Anthony, don't let that man take your flag." These are the stories of Black women and men and children who refused white supremacy. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about nonviolence because most of my book, especially in the introduction, really talks about sort of the limitations of how we understand nonviolence. We Refuse offers a fundamental shift into how we understand and talk about Black response to white supremacy. Often, when Black people are up against white violence, society presents them with two options. Malcolm X or Martin Luther King, are you going to be violent or are you going to be nonviolent? Those become, sort of the city of or community of brotherly love or by any means necessary. Or a more modern version of, are you going to burn it all down or are you going to forgive? Like these become the choices, violence or nonviolence. And nonviolence to me is based on the principle that one can morally persuade their oppressor to have a pang of conscience or conviction regarding their wrongness. The abolitionists employed nonviolence, compassion, empathy, and morality to compel one another's humanity. But I take issue with how the binary of nonviolence and violence has controlled the praxis and narrative by which oppressed people combat their oppression, which I write about in my first book and also in We Refuse. I argued that Black abolitionists believed that slavery was created by force and therefore sustained by force, and it only made sense that it would be overthrown with violence. This is the argument that I make in my first book. That nonviolence on its own was not expansive enough to rectify the harm that was caused by slavery and racism. And that by promoting and celebrating nonviolence as the only acceptable form of resistance has become rife with handicaps. For example, my ancestors' remedy for Arnesta might fall under the category of nonviolence, since no one physically harmed the doctor for making his proposal. But my ancestors' refusal was complex, and it is too reductive to label it and throw it in a pile labeled nonviolence. My ancestor's refusal was fundamental to her granddaughter's survival. First, she refused the doctor's offer. Then she sought every natural remedy she possessed to stop the infection and heal Arnesta's body. She did not plead or bargain with the doctor. She did not try to convince him that Arnesta was a child or human. Her refusal, remedy, and protection transcended violence or nonviolence. She took the doctor out of the equation. The doctor had no compassion for the child. He could not be morally persuaded. Violence against him would have been a death sentence for both of them, but nonviolence would have also ensured my great-grandmother's death. White supremacy and anti-Blackness is always violent, and the constant refrain is for the harmed to forgive violence, forget injury, forfeit their agency. But friends, I believe we have more than two options, that Black people need not choose between certain death or a life in bondage. And we have throughout history approached such violence with an array of responses and refusals. So for too long, I think our only model has been that of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And many of King's beliefs have been diluted at best or perverted at worst. American society presents a whitewashed nonviolence that often speaks nothing of white supremacy, capitalism, or militarism. And I often find that King's beliefs were not wrong, but merely incomplete. They did not always encompass the full range of human responses that people engage in, particularly in the face of death. King's 6 principles do not address action steps for the oppressors, only the oppressed. They do not address reparations, which may not be purely monetarily, or how to repair the harm of white supremacy. How do people heal, not just after breaking a bone or stepping on a rusty nail, but after losing a loved one, land, wealth, health, and after psychological trauma? And in a spiritual and secular sense, King's principles do not address repentance. What does it look like to turn from the ways of an oppressor? What does it look like to relinquish power? These missing principles are what activists today are still trying to navigate, not how we employ Black harm for transformation, but how do we mitigate harm altogether? Today, nonviolence has dwindled down to marches. And when a Black woman or man or child is killed by racial violence, people march. But marches do not keep Black people alive. Marches honor the dead. Marches are public mourning, not public policy. And whenever racial altercations gain traction in the media, pundits and politicians alike are quick to point to King as the model for doing things the right way. After racial violence results in death, the media's question is, will the protests be peaceful? Or an even more egregious question, does the victim's family forgive the perpetrator? Marches, forgiveness, and peaceful protests are all shorthands for callbacks to King. But nonviolence means something different today than what it did when King intended it. Now it is a performance of passive power that almost ensures that those in power never structurally change. White supremacy does not believe in nonviolence because it does not believe in Black humanity. To white supremacy, nonviolence is a scarecrow, and racists rest like crows on its outstretched arms. Nonviolence alone could never sufficiently frighten or endanger political, economic, or social institutions. So a word on violence. Violence is more than just an engine of white supremacy. Violence is an entire ecosystem. Violence is a tool employed to harm, deny, restrict, neglect, separate, and deceive. Notably, it can be a means to various ends. It can be used to enforce white supremacy or to undermine a government. Violence is slavery and segregation. Violence is theft and hoarding. Violence is replacing the truth with conspiracy. Violence is rupture and separation. Violence occupies the space of a system, an ideology, a language, and a culture. And violence can take many forms. And Black people spend much of their lives, if not their entire lives, combating, addressing, avoiding, and subverting white violence. And it is impossible to write a book that offers a critical analysis on violence and does not interrogate white supremacy as the lead perpetrator. We demand that people of color remain nonviolent, but we fail to ask the most important question. Why are white Americans so violent? Why are white Americans so violent? Whiteness is not compelled by suffering, but consumed with inflicting it. And white supremacy, at its core, in its symptoms, and in its manifestations, is violence. Building on Toni Morrison's famous 1975 Portland State University speech, in which he said that racism is a distraction because it keeps you from doing your work, literary critic Sandy Alexander described anti-Black racism that arises from white supremacy as not merely a thorn in a person's side, it is also a suffocating knee on a person's neck. And during the summer of 2020, she argued that racism was so distracting, it deprioritized a whole global pandemic. She says that racism has been so flagrantly murderous, it has absolutely no qualms about being caught on camera. In fact, it will pose for it. We Refuse focuses on Black response to white supremacy. And it reframes the conversation away from the rightness or wrongness of nonviolence and instead focuses on what works. We Refuse examines 5 ways that Black women have successfully engaged white supremacy beyond nonviolence. I study revolution, protection, force, flight, and joy. And I readily admit that even these broad categories are not exhaustive. But in We Refuse, I hope to uncover them as a set of possibilities among many. For me, revolution is about forfeiture and a new beginning. It's about replacing broken systems with just systems, such as in the Haitian Revolution. And for me, protection is best understood through the efforts of the abolitionist movement and the Underground Railroad. Black and white people protected family, friends, and fugitives from the violence of slavery and the snare of slave catchers. Force looks at how Black people employed their Second Amendment rights to protect themselves from the violence of the Ku Klux Klan. And flight looks at Black people who left maybe temporarily or maybe forever, but always in search of belonging. And lastly, I study the potency of joy. I contend that the opposite of violence is not nonviolence. In America, the opposite of violence is the fullness of Black humanity bound together with joy. And I chose these categories because throughout my life, I have researched or witnessed or experienced the utility of them all. Their impacts can blend into one another. Sometimes revolutions involve force. Sometimes flight is motivated by protection. Sometimes flight and force are joyful. Many will remember the viral footage of the brawl that took place in Montgomery, Alabama, at a riverfront park in August of 2023. A dock worker that was a dock that was historically used as a place to import African slaves to the Deep South. A Black dock worker was attacked by several white men who refused to abide by his instructions to move their boat. The white attackers shoved the Black man and began to overwhelm him. In minutes, dozens of nearby Black men and women joined the fight to help the dock worker by jumping on white assailants and landing blows in return, including one teenager who jumped from a boat and swam to the dock to defend him, and another Black man who swung a folding chair at white attackers to fend them off from harming more people. Within hours, the internet exploded with GIFs and jokes and memes and reenactments, and even merch to celebrate resistance, Black resistance to white violence. One white man was dragged to the point where his Crocs became socks. My personal favorites were Fade in the Water, referring to the 16-year-old boy as Malcolm Phelps, and Aquaman, a quote by Shirley Chisholm that said, "If they don't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair." Collectively, both in person and virtually, Black people were refusing the violent treatment of white voters. Black people rejected ill treatment. They protected each other. They used the force to stop their attackers. They ran toward trouble and celebrated and laughed and memorialized Black refusal with relentless joy and mockery. Poking fun robs whiteness of its legitimacy. Humor undoes the authority of white supremacy. It reveals its irrationality. The lessons of refusal and joy were bound up on that Alabama dock. The initial response to an altercation like Montgomery is anger. And don't dismiss this. Theologian James Cone contended that anger and humor are like the right and left arm. They complement each other. Anger empowers the poor to declare their uncompromising opposition to oppression, and humor prevents them from being consumed by their fury. Throughout history, Black people have employed a plethora of tools to combat anti-Blackness. And these categories do the work of expanding nonviolence, and in some cases, giving credence to violence when it works. Liberation is forceful, but that does not make freedom illegitimate. It simply makes it hard. So with the time I have left, I'd like to share two stories with you about Black men and women who employed principles of either revolution, protection, force, or flight, or joy to combat their enslavement. In 1850, the fugitive slave law was a game changer. For nearly 20 years, the abolitionists had been working toward the eradication of slavery, and they'd only seen slavery expand. And I try to put myself in the position of the abolitionists a lot, because I think about like the Black Lives Matter movement and how old it is, and to think about being at a movement and working it for decades and never seeing progress, never seeing any new policy or legislation that would benefit your movement. That's what the abolitionists were up against. All new legislation favored slavery. And the fugitive slave law was one of those policies. It stated that if an enslaved person ran away, the master could travel anywhere and retrieve them. It didn't matter if the enslaved person ran away 5 days ago or 5 years ago. They could be living in freedom longer than their enslavement. It didn't matter. The new Mason-Dixon line was Canada's border. And white Northerners could be deputized on the spot to help retrieve runaways or face a $1,000 fine or 6 months in prison. The law presented many Black people with two options: flee or fight. Many Black Americans fled the country, but most chose to stay and fight. I think about Black abolitionist Martin Delany, who said, "If an officer searching for fugitives crosses the threshold of my door and I do not lay him a lifeless corpse at my feet, I hope the grave may refuse my body a resting place and my righteous heaven, my spirit a home." I'm like, wow, really, Delany? Like, he's basically saying, I wish somebody would come to my door. I wish you would try to take a fugitive. I will take you out. William Parker, also a leader on the Underground Railroad, said, "The laws of personal protection are not made for us, and we are not bound to obey them. If a fight occurs, I want the whites to keep away. They have a country and may obey the laws, but we have no country." Parker says this in 1851. He says that about 5 or 6 years before the Dred Scott decision, which basically said Black people were not citizens and white people, or Black people had no rights, which white people were bound to respect. Well, a fight did occur, known as the Christiana Resistance. And I talk about this both in We Refuse and in Force and Freedom. It's one of my favorite stories to tell. And I feel like it's also a story that people are not very familiar with. And I won't get into all the details for sake of time, but I will try to give you the highlights. In 1851, 4 escaped slaves fled slaveholding Maryland for the free state of Pennsylvania. And William and Eliza Parker lived right on the border, and their home was a haven for runaways. So fugitives would come to them all the time, and they created their own Black Lancaster Protection Society and pledged to protect fugitive slaves even at the risk of their own lives. So the Parkers, but also other Black people living in the community, other white abolitionists, other Quakers, were all in agreement with them. So when the 4 men showed up to the Parkers' home, William and Eliza Parker gave them shelter. But within hours, Edward Gorsuch, the owner of the men who owned these fugitives, showed up to Parker's home, primarily because of Parker's reputation. He showed up with his son and his nephew and a U.S. Marshal, and Gorsuch demanded his property be returned to him. William refused. And Eliza, and this is what I love about Eliza, because Edward Gorsuch is at the door. It's like a movie in my head. Edward Gorsuch is at the door saying, like, I want my 4 men back. I want my 4 slaves back. And William Parker's like, over my dead body. And then Eliza is in the kitchen, and her brother-in-law is panicking, like, just give them up, just give them up. Eliza picks up a corn cutter and says, I will chop off the head of the first person who tries to give them up. And I was like, oh, snap, Eliza. But it's like this corn cutter is not just for slave catchers. It's not just for slave holders. This corn cutter is for cowards. Like, we will not tolerate this. And she goes up to the attic and she starts to sound this horn to sound the alarm for the Black Lancaster Protection Society that, they need help. And so when she starts doing this, she's blowing the horn, like the U.S. Marshal, all of Gorsuch's men, they're actually shooting at the window. It's only, thanks be to God, that they lived in a stone house, that the bullets are not actually hitting Eliza while she blows this horn. But within minutes, over 80 men and women showed up to the Parker home armed with rifles, pistols, and farm equipment. And even some Quakers there, some pacifists were there, y'all. And seeing that they were outnumbered, the U.S. Marshal took off. And I think that's probably him right there taking off. But Edward Gorsuch stood his ground. And as it goes, sort of like no one knows who fired the first shot. But there is a skirmish and altercation begins. Edward Gorsuch is shot. He's also beaten up by his former slaves. And William Parker recalls that as Gorsuch lay dying on the ground, his pistol fallen at his hands, which you can see right there, he says something that kind of stumped me in my tracks. You know how, like, if you're in the archives and you're doing research or you're reading a narrative and you read something and you're like, what? Like, that's the moment I had. Because he says, Edward Gorsuch lay on the ground dying, and the women put it into him. The women put it into him. And I was just blown away by that. And it showed me a lot of things, that violence is not gendered, that this was not just a situation in which men had to protect the women, but women were also on the battlefield protecting each other. So the Battle of Christiana was a victory for Black abolitionists. William Parker and the 4 men escaped north. In fact, Frederick Douglass housed these 4 men. He gave them shelter in their home, in his home in Rochester, New York, and he helped them get to Canada, where they lived out the rest of their days as free people. There was a case, people were arrested, but it ended in a mistrial, and no one was held accountable for Edward Gorsuch's death. Black protection and force and eventually flight won the battle that day. So one more story I want to share with you as well, and it's about joy. I think it's sort of a powerful way to wrap up and to think about where we are right now. Refusal for me is also a key component to joy. And while whiteness cannot be separated from violence, Blackness can be separated from oppression. The deep well of humanity that Black people must draw upon is not pure optimism. Joy is rooted in radical love, hope, and the complete confidence in the capacity of Black people. It is the ultimate expression of humanity. Joy is a haven. And there are ways in which enslaved people have carved out maroon societies for themselves to experience joy that cannot be stolen. And some of the most potent examples of joy and refusal have come from slavery. And this is where we get my second story. A story that I read about through historian Stephanie Camp, who talks about this in her book, Closer to Freedom. This is the story of an enslaved woman named Nancy Williams, who was a young adult when freedom finally came for her at the end of the Civil War. When she was enslaved as a teenager, though, she would slip away from her Virginia plantation in the middle of the night and travel a few miles into the woods, away from prying eyes and ears. There in the heart of the forest, she gathered with other enslaved people to dance and drink the night away. In African-American vernacular, Nancy recalled, "Them dances was something." These dance parties were also illicit and illegal during slavery. No enslaved person could be off the plantation without permission, and of course, permission to party would have never been granted. Thus, enslaved people had to carefully plan their soirees and hold them deep in the woods in the middle of the night. Some enslaved people brought musical instruments, some brought banjos and fiddles and tambourines. Undoubtedly, they were makeshift drums, and just like that, it was a party. Men and women strutted and hooped and hollered with laughter. And Nancy could dance. She showed off her dance skills by balancing a glass of water on top of her head and dancing without spilling a drop. 3 boys bet on her. She reminisced fondly with humor, out there in the middle of the floor just dancing with me and Ginny and the devil. Nancy had gone to great lengths to prepare her outfit for that evening. She had dyed her dress yellow and added ruffles. She had even made matching yellow shoes. They were ill-fitting and hurt her feet, but Nancy did not care. She was beautiful and adorned by her own handiwork. Even with painful shoes, Nancy admitted, "That didn't stop me from dancing." The joy of dancing and being cute superseded her desire to be comfortable or even practical. When Nancy was asked how she managed to get materials of her yellow dress and matching yellow shoes, she chuckled. "How'd I get them? I stole them." She stole all that she needed to make her outfit, from the additional cloth to the paint that she used to color her shoes, and she was not ashamed. In fact, she was nearly eager to tell her interviewer about her ingenuity. And I use this picture here because this is not Nancy. Obviously, we don't have footage of that, but I use this picture because it's a popular photo within slave history that actually takes place in the Low Country in South Carolina. And obviously, this would also take place at night, but during the day, you get to see just how the plantation is far in the distance. So it's meant to show you that this is away from the white gaze, away from prying eyes. And then you sort of see all of the enslaved people who are dancing in the center. You see off to the right, there's the banjo, which is a uniquely African-American instrument. And you have makeshift drums. You have what looks like alcohol or rum or wine that's at their feet. And then off to the left-hand side, I imagine who might be Nancy. Nancy in her bright yellow dress, talking to a man and another man who's got an arm around her. I'm like, okay, Nancy, get it. But she's having a good time. And I think about this a lot because I'm not trying to negate the fact that slavery was awful and violent and horrific. And there was no happiness in slavery, to be sure. That's a question that gets asked that's, if you ever want to enrage a historian, ask them if slaves were ever happy. No. But was there joy? Yes. And joy and happiness are different. They are not the same thing. Joy is insistence. Joy invokes your humanity, claims your humanity. And that's what Nancy was doing. Nancy's joy was about the reclamation of her time, labor, and beauty. Adornment is a form of declaring pride in oneself. Nancy wanted to feel attractive and beautiful. Even her choice of yellow was bold. She wanted to be seen, to be the center of attention, to be the sun personified. Yellow is joy and light. She moved as far away as possible from the muted brown rags of slavery. And on that night, she was vibrant and seen, glowing from head to toe in spectacular, warm, joyful yellow, dancing until her feet hurt. There is much to love about this story. Nancy had moments during her enslavement that she carved out for herself for her own enjoyment. She knew that if she was caught, the consequences could be dire for all involved, but she did not care. She prioritized her own joy, even if only for a few hours. Enslaved people showed up at that gathering spot and engaged in physical and emotional form of resistance to their enslavement. Camp argues that enslaved partygoers had a common commitment to delight in their bodies, to display their physical skill, to master their bodies through competition with others, and to express their creativity. They literally pushed past the boundaries of their plantation and their masters' well to steal pleasure and even independence for themselves. As an elderly Christian woman, Nancy shied away from approving of her past actions, but it is impossible for her not to look back at her moment of rebellion with a feeling of victory. She was not free, but she did not get caught. Enslavement meant constant surveillance in addition to violence, hard labor, and sexual assault, and the severance of families. Slaveholders were bent on watching every interaction among the enslaved. Even dance parties hosted by slaveholders for the enslaved were attempts at controlling Black pleasure. The white gays made sure no one drank too much, partied too hard, or stayed too long. Everything down to attendance was ordered, but enslaved people pushed back on their confinement and against the will of their slaveholder. Dancing at secret parties was a joyous rebellion free from prying eyes. Professor Tara Bynum discusses how Black scholars and the general public do not talk enough about what feels good to Black people when there is no white gaze. Because of white supremacy, we confuse to be watched or even inclusive of others. Our ancestors gave us many tools and tricks, if you will, and we can make use of them today. So you might be thinking about the state of the world, the state of politics, the election, Gaza, academia, the state of our climate or healthcare system, the state of our prison system or educational system, and you might be angry. You should be. Anger is useful, though. Audre Lorde argued, anger prevents you from becoming stagnant and resigned. Anger is the engine of refusal. But our anger should never be left alone. It must be tethered to hope, and hope is tethered to joy. And hope and joy stem from a place of promise and purpose. Wendell Urban Berry, who is a writer and farmer and environmentalist activist, argues that when it comes to fixing societal problems, people often want a solution as large scale as the problem. But rarely can any major problem be solved in this way. Instead, he suggested what is needed is countless small solutions that can chip away at the core issues. But small interpersonal solutions do not satisfy America's need for drama. At a surface level, refusal and joy does not feel adequate. At best, it can feel dismissive, at worst, like salt in a wound. But refusal is not a simple declaration. It is a verb. Moreover, joy is not mere optimism. It is the conviction that nothing big or small can be tackled without first believing it is possible. I think about the small but powerful ways we can all refuse and find joy to combat violent systems. So I need to close, but I want to leave you with my epilogue. I'm going to bring it to present day. This is a conversation that my husband and I had about when he was a lifeguard. He was a lifeguard while he was in high school, and when he got this job at like a local beach, he was getting training from his instructors about what to do if they spotted someone drowning. His instructor said if the person was panicking, he needed to be careful. A person who was flailing could drown a lifeguard by attempting to jump on them and push them down underwater. If the panicking, drowning person was bigger than him, this could be a real problem. The instructor's guidance was simple. Let them drown. It is better to rescue a person after they've lost consciousness than to risk being pulled under. Once unconscious, they can be safely rescued and brought to the shore, and then a lifeguard or a paramedic can conduct CPR and resuscitate them. Let them drown. It seems harsh, but I understood the rationale behind it. A panicked person is a danger to themselves and others. I think about this principle often. It is that white Americans are lounging in a community pool propped up with all kinds of floaties because they cannot swim. They feel that someone, a woman, an immigrant, is going to remove a device that allows them to float, so they scream, they splash, they kick, and they lose their balance. White people fear the loss of their superiority, advantage, and safety. They are irrational. They do not need to hoard all the floaties. In fact, they can just stand up and the water will be at their waist. But they do not trust anyone. They are kicking and punching and flailing their arms in a panic. In a toxic political environment, I ask myself, how should we approach these people? Do we let them drown? What does that look like? What does that mean for American democracy? Letting someone drown is a refusal to engage a panicked person. Many Black people know what rescue and resuscitation looks like in a democracy. It is the work and activism that Black women do daily at their jobs, in their communities, and for their families. And make no mistake, there is nothing good in America that can be accomplished without Black women's labor and intellect. When we refuse, revolt, quit, leave, withhold, strike, boycott, or simply carve out a space that denies the white gaze, institutions must concede. Allowing the drowning is the demand that white people must relinquish their hold on power and violence and control. The warning before the drowning is to call out, let go, stand up, you are not dying. When America is rescued and resuscitated, then people will have to answer the hard questions. How do we engage each other as human beings? When Jamaica Kincaid wrote A Small Place, which is one of my favorite books, regarding her fraught understanding and relationship with her native home of Antigua, she concluded by writing about Christopher Columbus's discovery of the island in 1493. She referred to the European settlers and slaveholders as rubbish, and all enslaved people as noble and exalted. In her mind, there was nothing to contest. Men and women who engaged in the practice of slavery were trash, and people who were enslaved were honorable and even morally superior. But when slavery collapsed, everyone had to reckon with their own humanity and the humanity of others. Kincaid acknowledged this. Once you cease to be a master, you are no longer human rubbish. You are just a human being, and all that adds up to. The same could be said for the enslaved. Once they are no longer slaves, once they are free, they are no longer noble and exalted. They are just human beings. White, Black, or Native, with slavery, there are no human beings. For people to become human, slavery needed to be eradicated. Black people, were unafraid to act. They were willing to trade in their identity as noble and exalted to be human. But too many white Americans have settled into their identity as rubbish. For too many white Americans, it is better to be hated than to be human. In 1993, science fiction author Octavia Butler published The Parable of the Sower about an apocalyptic United States that is ravaged by corrupt leadership, deadly plagues, and rampant violence, all in the year of 2024. She wrote, drowning people sometimes die fighting their rescuers. Drowning people sometimes die fighting their rescuers. Black Americans and other people of color cannot risk their lives saving someone who is unwilling to recognize that their panic is causing harm. The wise lifeguard will watch and wait. It can be agonizing, but waiting is not careless. The refusal is not so much a no as a not now. When the hysterical swimmer grows tired and weary and weak and is just on the brink of unconsciousness, then and only then the lifeguard will rescue them from the water. In the chaotic world that Americans live in, Black people can pull in the heavy unconscious bodies of extremism and hope that their revival from a near-death experience will be transformative. Or we can let whiteness drown in the violence of its own making. But when we refuse, it is in our power to determine how we can best preserve our lives and the lives of others. So finally, I return to my great-great-great-grandmother's refusal. Her refusal to pick from the metaphorical fork in the road. She stomped out a new trail for Arnesta. She rejected dehumanization. And yes, Arnesta limped. But her limp was not the totality of her life. She lived, she loved, she laughed. That's my grandfather and her in the kitchen. She poured into the lives of others and into the life of my mother. This is my mother when she was 3 years old with her grandmother. I believe Toni Morrison gave us all clear instructions. And this is a quote that's been going around a lot, but I think it's a perfect way to conclude this talk. She says, "There is no time for despair, no place for self-pity, no need for silence, no need for fear. We speak, we write, we do language. That is how civilizations heal. Throughout history, we, like my ancestor, have chosen life with a limp over the social death of white supremacy." If I could add to Morrison's brilliant words, I would say, we also revolt, we protect, we fight, we leave, we sing, we laugh, we liberate, we refuse. Thank you.